You're listening to Robinson Ventures Radio, where ingenuity meets innovation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, or evening, or morning, depending upon when you're listening. Today on Robinson Ventures Radio, we have invited the senior executive team from ThinkGenetic to come in and talk about not only the company, but their origination story and the why behind the ingenuity and innovation that they've created that is embedded within ThinkGenetic. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave Jacob, who Dave is the origination story, I think is the way I joke around with it for ThinkGenetic. So Dave, if you could please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ian. Again, I'm Dave Jacob. So I'm one of the three founders. You'll meet the other two shortly. And I'm kind of the poster child. I'm the one with the genetic condition that kind of started this whole thing. I basically function in the sales role within ThinkGenetic today. And I'll turn it over to my business partner, who I've been with since we've been partners since 2006, to introduce what he's doing in ThinkGenetic.
Yeah, so my name's Len Barker. Like Dave said, I've been working with him running various business ventures for the last 20-some years. We were IBM software consultants and had a thriving business. Then we decided that was too easy. Let's try to solve some of the world's problems. And I went along for the ride as president of ThinkGenetic, where I run the daily operations.
And if we're moving on to me, I'm Dawn Laney. I'm a genetic counselor by training. I am the director of clinical trials and genetics at Emory, and I also see clinical patients. But in the world of ThinkGenetic, I'm the chief genetic officer and a co-founder. And I got pulled into this all by my dad.
I am Ruth O'Keefe, and I handle the marketing and advocacy efforts over at ThinkGenetic. So I have a unique role of working on both highlighting our client relationships, but also working with the clinical team to help in any way and capacity that I can, as well as get pulled into some of our investment opportunities. I went to school for advertising and public relations before social media and digital marketing was as big of a thing as it is now. And I joined Dave and Len in their technology company at that time and was really just focused on traditional marketing tactics. And over time, I got more and more pulled into digital marketing, website development, and all the things that go along with that over time. And so when ThinkGenetic was formed, I was lucky enough to be able to pivot away from some of those things and apply those skills to ThinkGenetic and grow that audience. And that's really where I focus most of my efforts now.
In addition to all the things that you bring to the table for ThinkGenetic, you are also related to Dave. Is that correct?
I am, yes. He is my papa.
And then Ruth, how are you related to Dawn? Obviously, you must be sisters.
She's my sister. Yeah, she's my big sister. Yeah, so I mean, we have a really incredible family, a lot of innovators and a lot of hardworking folks. Nobody in my family sits on their laurels. We all have projects and passion projects and side hustles and all those kind of things.
What's the story here, and how did we get started with this idea that became ThinkGenetic?
We didn't start out as a genetic family or a family that worked in advocacy. The advocacy I did was all at work. But when my dad was born, and he'll tell you more about this, he was born with a congenital heart defect, which they repaired, which was pretty experimental back in the day. But around about the time I had my first son, my dad was 60, and he came to visit and was really ill. And then we got our first clue, well, our second clue, that perhaps there's something going on genetic underlying the health issues that he suddenly was having.
It's true that I had the birth defect and congenital heart failure, and that was repaired when I was 5. Also turns out that my little sister Carol had the same condition, same surgery. And when I was visiting Dawn for the birth of her son, my second grandson, I got pneumonia. And when in the course of the treatment for pneumonia, they did a chest x-ray and discovered that I had this large aortic aneurysm, 4.2 centimeters, if you happen to be counting. And I thought, boy, this is kind of odd. Where did this come from? And still didn't know anything about genetics. We just knew, oh, my heart's acting up again. So I called my sister Carol and said, sis, go get an echocardiogram. I'm curious whether you might have the same thing that I do. And she got the echocardiogram. It turns out she had the same aneurysm. And when I told Dawn that woke Dawn up to say, this might be genetic. I think we better think about this. And then I'll let her go back to what we did about it.
Yeah. So, when you're looking at something within your family, you don't really think about genetics that much. I mean, when you're going through school, right? If you ever have gone to a biology class, or if you've ever spent any time learning about different genetic diseases or different regular diseases, you're like, ooh, I could have that. Or, oh, my family could have that. But you never really think about it for real. And so I knew that my dad and his sister both had this congenital heart defect. I knew that it was significant enough that they had to wait until they were larger to get it fixed, and that it was a life-threatening congenital heart defect. And I just thought about all the different reasons that could be. It could be autosomal recessive. It could be autosomal dominant. Like, these are all the different patterns things run in families. It could be because the mom smoked during pregnancy. Like, there's all these things that could lead to the heart defects that they had. But the fact that 2 out of 4 kids had it is a little surprising. But they were prepared. They were having normal lives. My dad was a pilot. My dad was a businessman. He played basketball. He ran. Like, I wasn't so worried about it. But when we found this aneurysm, and his sister had the aneurysm too, I was like, well, you do have really big hands, and we can stretch your eyelids all the way out to about 4 inches from your face. And you do have awfully nice velvety skin. I think we need to send you over to Johns Hopkins to get evaluated for connective tissue disorder, because these kind of features we're seeing with him, with the type of skin he has, with the elasticity of his skin, with this heart defect in him and his sister, made me think, okay, this could be an inherited connective tissue disorder. So I went up and saw world famous Hal Dietz, who's an amazing connective tissue guy, and he ruled out some of the biggies. He ruled out Marfan syndrome. He ruled out Lowy Dietz. These are all, very, none of these genetic diseases are common, but these are all the diseases that you think about when you think about connective tissue disorders. He didn't have the big ones. And so we were kind of like, okay, he doesn't have the big ones. Maybe it's just what we call a familial aneurysm syndrome. So that's just our fancy way of saying, you got aneurysms in your family? But we didn't have a specific genetic cause. Well, I was like, hey, Dad, I know you're really curious. Why don't you join an adult congenital heart defect support group? Why don't we think about, looking at looking at everybody's heart to make sure they don't also have these giant aortas? And he was like, nope, not good enough. He's like, there's a reason. Tell me the reason. I want to know why. Because he's a seeker and a finder, and he's an innovator, and he wants to figure out what's going on. So finally, I'm like, okay, Dad, these giant genetic tests called exomes are much more common now. And what they do is look at all the different gene codes that actually are connected to disorders or functioning genes that we know at this time. So what'd I do, Dad?
So that year for my Christmas present, she came home saying, I took a course at Emory and I can now draw your blood. So she had the whole family sit under the Christmas tree and then bare their arms. And basically we all got bled out. And then she had us tested, and they found out that indeed I had a connective tissue disorder, but they still didn't know which one. It took another 3 years before we finally figured it out.
Yeah, the strange thing about exomes is that you read through it once and you get the sequence of the letters, but genetics still hasn't gone all the way to figuring out what different changes in those genes mean. So it's kind of still art, right? You look at it and you're like, maybe this means something, maybe it doesn't. And we didn't find the first real good answer at the first pass. But 3 or 4 years later, because I worked, downstairs from the genetics lab, they said, hey, we've got a lot more data. Maybe we should reanalyze your exome. And I was like, go for it. So they did. They reanalyzed my dad's exome. And they're like, hey, we found the answer, which led to a very exciting call between me and my dad, which told him that after age 60, he'd just been diagnosed with a genetic disease. He had a mutation. And actually, if we were looking at his wall, you could see that he then wanted to make sure that everybody knew about it. So we did a poster at one of the meetings. They did everything from showing him pulling out his eyelid to explaining how it runs in the family, and how we then got everybody tested and had testing like echoes and EKGs to see how everybody's heart was doing. So far, it's my dad and Carol, his sister, that we've been watching most closely. And everybody else, knock on wood, has been looking pretty good. But we're all still fairly young, give or take. So we're still watching.
So Dawn and Dave and Len, in that process, and that's like, like you said, decades of moving through this. And then only towards the end, when technology caught up, it sounded to me like you had identified a problem, not only from the standpoint that, Dave, you have a rare genetic condition, but the fact that you couldn't find any information on that rare genetic condition seemed to have really irked you. And that was the process of the problem identification, which was, hey, I've got this, but I don't know anything about it.
I would say that that is absolutely it. So where's the business?
Right.
So while this was all going on, of course, I'm out like most rare genetic patients that don't know they're rare genetic, out Googling in the middle of the night saying, my doctor doesn't understand me and he doesn't understand what I have. And I have this aneurysm and they're going to do surgery someday, but I want to know where it came from and why does my sister have it too? So as things would work out, Len and I were talking about what should we do next with our business, the consulting business. And IBM shows up with a supercomputer that wins Jeopardy. And they come to the business partner community, of which we're one, and say, you got any ideas for healthcare? And Len and I decided, well, let's see if we can build a business case, see if there is a business in here about, can we help people get diagnosed sooner? And how many are there? And is there any money in it and whatnot? And we found out that there were 350 million people in the world with one of these 7,000 rare genetic diseases. Only about 25% are diagnosed. And pharma's spending $5 billion a year looking for people like me. So we're saying, well, that's a business. I don't know how to solve that problem, but I know that with our technology background, maybe we can build an application that will do that. So, but we don't know anything about genetics. We don't know anything about medical. We're great with search and AI and those kind of things. We know technology. So how do we teach it about medical, and what should we do? So that's when we decided to call. I said, well, I have this daughter that's pretty good in genetics. Let's see if she's interested. And she decided that she would join us and be the responsible party for figuring out how to train Watson in genetics. So we still didn't have a business. We didn't have any money, but IBM did ask for an application. So we sent in a request for a commercial use of Watson. We wrote basically the equivalent of a business plan to them, and they accepted it. So we're one of the first 10 companies that got to use Watson for real. And then we're like, uh-oh, now we got to go build this thing, and we have no money. So again, Dawn got involved, and we wrote some grants, and we got about $500,000 in seed money to prove that it could work. And this is a good time for Len to jump in and say he's being drug into the family business to try and solve this problem, and kind of how he takes to that.
Right. So, like I said, I was just kind of on the sidelines watching this saga unfold. However, very, very curious, being the entrepreneur and IT type person that I was, about how we might be able to solve this. So we dove right into Watson, trying to figure out ground truths and things we needed in order to train it to answer questions. And we, eventually learned that there's more to it than just dumping all the knowledge in the world into Watson and hoping that it can spit out the right answers. So changing our direction a little bit and take that whole process in-house and hire some staff to train it specifically on what we were trying to do.
So IBM and Watson were a great first place to start, but then you had to pivot out of that due to perhaps some technical limitations, or what was there that you said, we need to do this on our own, and this is why?
And we were under the misconception, like I said, of just being able to dump information into Watson and get an answer out. But even IBM would have told you that that's not how it works. You need to really train it. And since Watson was more of a black box to us than it was to IBM, of course, they knew how it was put together. We couldn't really train it the way we wanted to because we didn't know how it worked. So we decided to say, thank you very much. We will create our own engine to answer questions. We've changed a lot about what we're doing since then, but we had better success with that, but we just still didn't come up with a business model.
Yeah, and I would add that training Watson was fascinating, because what we would do in the early days is we'd come up with a question and an answer, and we would write it in a spreadsheet, and then they would upload it into Watson, and then we'd see what it would answer. But what it was doing was cutting and pasting answers out of the text that we gave it, and it didn't have any intelligence behind it yet. And I think that's when we realized that this was definitely not going to be what was going to solve our problem. And our problem was, how do we decrease the time to diagnosis for patients who are running around with rare diseases, rare genetic diseases? And I think we learned pretty quick that we could use the same amount of time and the same amount of expertise and knowledge of harnessed from genetic counselors and medical geneticists and develop our own detailed algorithms. And then we had to find our use case.
And so where did that use case come from? How did you turn, okay, so you've done a why, you have like an amazing why, and Dawn, your why is your dad. I mean, right? That's just as deep a why as you could possibly have as a human and a business person. Sometimes they're not one and the same, I swear to God. But you have this deep why. You've identified a unique problem, which is trying to figure out how to get people information on a diagnosis, or to help them on their potential path to diagnosis, right? Yeah. And as Len said, and we have the tech, but now where's the business come from? How does that, where did the use case pop out of?
Yeah, and I think the first thing we determined is we were not there to diagnose people. We were there to support the clinicians making the diagnosis. We were also there to support the people trying to find a diagnosis, but mostly by opening the dialogue between a patient and their healthcare provider, and then giving the provider the support they need to help diagnose things. So we figured that out pretty early. That was where our sweet spot was going to be. And then, you know, we spent some quality time in startup incubators.
Before ThinkGenetic, what was the if you could give us just like an estimate of what was the standard diagnosis time, if there was one? Did it take on average the same amount of time it took you guys, or does it just vary case to case?
It depends a lot from diagnosis to diagnosis. You do newborn screening for a certain number of diseases, so that's a pretty early diagnosis. But the ones that have non-specific syndromes, so the ones that you can walk around with for a while, and there's a bunch of them, it can be 60 years, it can be 10 years. And each disease, they'll give you a different thing. There's one disease where you're born and you've got a difference in your genitalia. We call that having their diagnosis on their bottom, but other diseases, it's harder to find them. And ones like my dad, where they don't necessarily impact daily life for a long time, but suddenly like really impact them and say like, guess what? You're going to have a surgery. You're going to have to be in heart-lung bypass. We hope you survive. Like that's not real comforting, because we think about all the people who have aneurysms, but have never had anybody ask about genetic testing. At one point, Tucker, my dad, I was there in the room with him and his cardiac surgeon, and I said, oh, he's got a genetic condition. That's the underlying issue here. And he's like, well, that's fine. I can refer you if you want to talk about that. I was like, you're doing the surgery. If his tissue is going to like shred like tissue paper, perhaps you might care, and it's not their fault. Like early training in medical diseases, you're not trained to think about the 7,000 genetic conditions that might be underlying what to you looks like a plumbing problem. So that's why we had to support healthcare providers, because there's this huge delay in diagnosis that just ranges. It just ranges, but it's too long, because we know that therapy only works better. And we're coming up with, all the pharmaceutical companies are coming up with amazing therapies, and you can't use them unless you do it early. So that's important.
Tucker, the most important thing about is a 60-year diagnosis. What's the most important thing to know? And the answer is you have to live 60 years. And a lot of people don't make it. So I was one of the fortunate ones. And actually, the day I went in for the aneurysm repair, I still had no symptoms. That I could still play basketball. I could do anything I ever did. What I ran was the risk of the aneurysm dissecting or bursting. And that's not a good thing. There's no recovery from that. But I had low blood pressure, and there was just no indication. If I hadn't gotten pneumonia, that saved my life by getting a chest x-ray. Otherwise, I would have continued without knowing, because I had no reason to know.
And you hear these stories over and over again that people are diagnosed pure serendipity. Like they just happen to show up in front of the right person with the right rash, or they happen to have a giant aorta when they had pneumonia. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be systematically done so everybody's records are looked at, so you can find out if they could have an increased risk for an underlying genetic cause for their health problems.
So Dawn, that's how you guys started going and giving birth to ThinkGenetic, because you're trying to solve that issue, problem, and challenge, right?
Yeah, it's for sure a passion project. If you think about it, our passion is that nobody else should have to be diagnosed by pure chance with a genetic disease where we know there's treatments that could really help them. In the case of an aortic aneurysm, depending on which connective tissue disorder, you may just have to take losartan every day. Now, it doesn't mean you may not see surgery down the line, but the longer you can put it off, the better.
Yeah, and then I remember, Dave, you talking about, look, hey, I had my annual, I've been with you guys long enough now to hear that. I've had my annual exam, and the aortic aneurysm is now these many centimeters. Right. And then, it got to so many centimeters that was like, okay, as Dawn so eloquently put it, the plumbing problem needs to be fixed. The great thing is the plumbing problem's fixed, right?
Yay.
And Ruth, what a deep, deep why that you all have, right? It's your dad, it's your sister, it's you all, like it's this family that has come together and has now created a something to solve a pretty robust problem that's out there, which is, how do you make sure, Dawn, you were so eloquently talking about how do you make sure you get these people diagnosed, not just by serendipity, but actual clinical pathways and purposeful. So with that, I'm going to ask, I think it's Dave, to talk about the business use case and where you guys got the business use case, how you got it initially funded, and how did you go from there?
sheer brilliance. So let me
Yeah.
talk about the sheer brilliance. So what we realized early on is we had technology, we had medical expertise, and we had no money except a small grant. So my job was to go find some money and find some customers. So I was wandering around Cambridge. I live in Boston. Cambridge is where many of the pharmaceutical companies are headquartered. So I'm knocking on doors, meeting people. And I also meet other entrepreneurs. And I happened to meet another entrepreneur who's a good friend of mine. And we decided to go to lunch because we weren't having the success selling that day. So over the course of lunch, Julie is her name. She said, Dave, you know, your idea is so great. You need to apply to the Mass Challenge. They're going to like your idea, and that could get you started and help you with the funding and raising seed capital and whatnot. And I said, sounds like a great idea. When is the application due? She said, midnight tonight. So I ran home and started typing, and I had no idea what the Mass Challenge was, but she said it was a good idea. So I thought, well, I'm going to go for it. So I did. I got it in just in time. And the next thing I know, I'm getting interviewed to become part of the Mass Challenge, which is a global incubator in Boston, accelerator, that I didn't realize was hard to get into. I just put my application in. But part of the application process is you get interviewed by companies that are interested in your idea. So you basically do speed dating, 10 minutes at a pitch, where you go in a room full of people you don't know, you tell your story, they evaluate, and you go to the next room and you do it again. And I did that, I think, 8 or 10 times in a day. And out of that came, you've been accepted, and your first client, which was a requirement of the Mass Challenge, is somebody has to agree to do business with you, was Shire Pharmaceutical, which is now part of Takeda. And they said, we will work with you to help you make this idea a reality. And that allowed me then, with that endorsement, to then raise some capital to build the prototype of the system, not the real system, but the prototype. And then we started talking to Shire/Takeda about, well, where could we apply this in the Takeda business? And they chose Taiwan as our first client in Takeda. So that's where we started doing the education on a couple of diseases that they happen to treat and care about. And so that got us going with the business case. At that same time, one of the things we did in the accelerator is every Friday, every final company, there were 30 of us, would do a 1-minute pitch to whoever showed up to talk about what we were doing and looking for additional clients and opportunities. And as luck would have it, Lafayette's accelerator, one of their representatives showed up and said, we like what you're doing. We would like you to consider joining our accelerator in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I was like, where? And that was the start of the conversation. And we decided that it was worth exploring further. And so we went to Lafayette, and that's when we met Cian and we met the other people and said, wow, these guys really are serious about technology and what we're doing. And so we joined that accelerator. And actually, we were one of the winners of that accelerator, which got us additional funding, got us additional money, got us another client, in this case, Lafayette General Hospital, to start working with making those records. And at the same time, Cian said, well, you ought to pivot from your outward facing client application to looking at medical records. We'll let you use Lafayette's records to see if we have any of these rare genetic patients. And so we pivoted the business to say, we're going to not only educate potential people on the internet, we're going to look at medical records and see if we can be more proactive in that space. And so through all of that, we were able to raise a total of about $2 million to build the initial product, get the clients on board, and start growing the business. So like I said, it was sheer brilliance that I had lunch with somebody that said, go apply to this, and it worked out, which I've decided in the course of startups is the way it really works. You just keep talking to people, and every once in a while you meet somebody that gets it.
I would just add to that story that Lafayette allowed us to, under a pilot project with IRB approval and a specific protocol and a contract, work with their medical records.
So Dawn, thank you very much for buttoning that up for our listeners, because in no way, shape, or form was this data sent out just willy-nilly. It was appropriately de-identified, put through an IRB review process, right? There was all kinds of goodness in there, but that also is barriers to entry. Right?
Yes.
There are significant barriers to entry to what you're doing. So talk to me about 1 or 2 times where you were like, okay, what in God's name are we doing? Or say it another way, 1 or 2 of your greatest challenges.
When I think of one of the biggest barriers we ran into is when we were first pitching to investors. We gave our story, we did our dance, we did our pitch, and they loved it. And they're like, but explain to us again who your client's going to be. They're like, you sound very passionate, like you love what you're doing, and this is a great problem to solve, but it sounds very altruistic. And we don't do altruism, we do dollars. And so we had a mentor who helped us narrow down our use case and our client, because in the early days, we were very much like, our challenge is that everybody talks to sees our passion, sees the why, but they don't see our business case. So our biggest challenge was trying to get ourselves to the business case, the one that's actually going to bring in revenue. And the good news is that actually with Cian's help here, we were able to narrow down two very strong products, one that is consumer facing, one that is electronic health records data facing. And it uses all that big data. So I would say that that was a big challenge that we got help with. You can't do this alone when you're a startup. And I think the incubators and the connections we made through our incubators and also our investors have led us through that particular problem. So we're able to solve it and come out really strong and have positive revenue.
So Ruth, I'm going to go to you now as what was that like one or two thing you were like, oh my goodness, this isn't, we're done. Like, what's our greatest challenge? Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always been very positive that we're going to get this done. I think sometimes I worry how we're going to get it done. Because like I said, everybody involved in a startup has other roles, has other jobs, has other passions going on. So even if this is our big goal, our big thing to do, we're dealing with just administrative things, scheduling of individuals, finding the right people, finding time to do certain things, not getting bottlenecked when we didn't have enough revenue yet to hire additional staff. Getting to that precipice of like, okay, well, how much harder can we push ourselves before we can bring someone else on to help with this? And then how do we make sure we can afford that person for more than 6 months a year? That I think for me was always one of the challenges.
And Ruth, what you just described, and you did, I don't know if you knew you described it, is the innovation, curve, which is, you have like bleeding edge adopters, really early idea, then you have early adopters, then you start heading towards what's called the chasm, which is how do you jump the chasm into sort of the mass market, adopters. And right now, like I think of you guys as like you're the, if our listeners are old enough and remember ET, where you're the kids on the bicycle that are pedaling like hell, and you've just jumped and you're hoping ET sticks his finger out and light up, like so you can get to the other side, right?
Yes,
and so the great part is like, with the growth we've seen you go through over the last, I would sit there and say 2 years, right? And the recent, like you talked about, like you just hired your first vice president of business development. Like she's out there every single day, knocking on the doors to get this product targeted towards the pharmaceutical companies who are actually the payers in this thing. They're the clients, right? And so like, we're hoping that Rini lands the little tricycle that kid's on, right? And is moving everything forward. But that's exactly right. It's like, every single day, it's not if there's going to be a challenge in the startup world. It's like, what's the challenge today? Like, what could kill the company today, right? Everybody on this call has their own appreciable talents that they're bringing to the table, right?
Yeah.
Dave, worked for, I call it Ed's Computers or EDS, right? And knew Ross Perot, right? Tucker, you probably maybe need to go look.
No, I know who Ross Perot is. Come on, man. I don't.
Right?
Come on, man.
I feel for Tucker
because Tucker, I used to be in your position where everyone would stop the conversation and be like, I don't know if you get this reference. I'd be like, I'm informed.
I had a coworker get impressed because I knew Mary J. Blige was the other day, and I'm like, come on, man.
Kind of the opposite. It's like you could ask us who she is. I don't know.
Right. I'm like,
I know who she is.
Well, and what's funny is Tucker, it's inverse. Is if it weren't for like you and Rory, I would know somewhere between Jack Squat right now what's going on out in the world in those areas. So anyway, right. So all right, so let's get back on track because Tucker, this is really usually what a ThinkGenetic meeting looks like anyway, right? Which is like, hey, look, a chicken, woo! So, Len, greatest challenge that you think you all have faced, or the quote, "What's going to kill the startup today?"
Right. I think one thing that is much different than when we were running a technology consulting company. When you're a brand new company, venture-backed company, you have to be quite often looking at the direction you're heading and say, is it right? Can we continue to go down this path if we want to, make it? And so we took significantly different paths all along the same mission all along the way. So first we started out trying to answer all the questions for living with people with a genetic condition. We were going to attract millions of people to our website and answer questions for them. And when people said, who's going to pay for that? Oh, I don't know. And so then we would move on to the next one. Well, we'll create a symptom matcher so they all come through there, and somehow well, that's a hard task. Then we changed it a little bit. So you can't change every second, but you do have to reevaluate. So each one of those inflection points for me was, can we make it from here? And I think we finally got there.
Always for me, it's we're going to run out of money, right? Can I get enough investment to go? I use the example of we are FedEx when they had one airplane, and we have an idea and we need money to buy 100 more. And we can't get 100 more till we get the money. But they don't know that it'll work because you only have one airplane. So how are you going to fly all over the country and deliver packages? It's the same idea. You got to buy into the vision, and trying to find the right person that shares that vision, like Takeda did, like you did at Lafayette General, is hard. And then finding somebody with deep enough pockets to say, I'm going to make the big investment so you can scale a lot faster. So I didn't expect we would be, this 5 years into this thing or 6 years into this thing, and we just hired our first salesperson. It's like, that should have been the first year. I'm a sales guy. I'm like, we need to have somebody out selling, even if it's not quite done yet. You got to go get clients, or it doesn't matter what you build if you run out of money. So I would say that's probably where I spend most of my time focusing.
And what's been brilliant is to watch the balance that occurs between you're wanting to out there go, let's go sell now, sell now. And then I'll watch Dawn go, but, and she, and Dawn, your voice was, well, we had an IRB and we had this, right? And so there seems to be this ongoing sort of balance. So how do you do that?
To hear more of our conversation with ThinkGenetic, then keep a lookout for part 2 of this episode of Robinson Ventures Radio, ThinkGenetic. And as always, thank you for tuning into Robinson Ventures Radio.